What really happened inside that house just one day before everything collapsed? When Conan O'Brien finally spoke about the Christmas party he hosted that night, he didn't sound like a television host. He sounded like someone carrying a memory he could no longer keep silent. According to Conan, he personally witnessed something that, at the time, felt deeply unsettling and openly disrespectful confrontation between Rob Reiner and his son, Nick. One day later, Rob Reiner and his wife were dead. At the time, no one believed they were watching the beginning of a tragedy. That Christmas gathering had always been known as a rare sanctuary in Hollywood, a place with no cameras, no performances, no carefully managed images. Just familiar faces, warm lights, the scent of pine, and conversations that didn't need to be rehearsed. It was the one place where people felt safe enough to let their guard down, but that night, something shifted. When Rob Reiner walked through the door with his family, the atmosphere changed without a single word being spoken. Rob smiled, the same smile he had worn for decades, yet those closest to him sensed it didn't come easily. His eyes weren't relaxed. He wasn't there to enjoy himself. It was as if he had arrived carrying a worry he couldn't put down. And then there was Nick. He didn't blend into the room. While others laughed and gathered in familiar circles, Nick moved alone, quietly scanning the faces around him. What disturbed people wasn't anger or shouting, it was the calm. The strange feeling that he wasn't looking at people as people, but measuring them, placing them into some private order that only he understood. No one knew it that night, but the warning signs were already there. And when everything finally fell apart, the most brutal truth wouldn't be what happened afterward, but how much had been visible long before no one could stop it. For many years, the annual Christmas party at Conan O'Brien's house had been something rare in Hollywood. It wasn't about networking. It wasn't about appearances. There were no cameras, no publicists, no unspoken rules about what could or couldn't be said. Conan guarded that space carefully, treating it like a sealed room where people who had lived too long under the spotlight could briefly return to being ordinary. Those who attended year after year remembered the same feeling. Warm lights reflected off glasses poured slowly by hand. The faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree mixed with quiet laughter. Old stories resurfaced not for an audience, but for people who already knew the endings. In a city built on performance, this house offered something different: safety, or at least, the illusion of it. Because even in places where no one is supposed to perform, everyone is still watching something. The question is whether they know what they're seeing. When people later tried to recall that night, many struggled to explain why it felt different. Nothing obvious had happened yet. No voices were raised. No arguments had begun. And yet, something was already off. Was it possible that the room sensed what the people inside it refused to name? Looking back, the contrast is almost cruel. A space designed to strip away power suddenly became the stage for it. A gathering meant to offer relief instead exposed a tension that had been building far beyond that night. And when tragedy struck the very next day, the memory of that sanctuary didn't feel comforting anymore. It felt fragile. And that fragility raises an uncomfortable question. How many warning signs can exist inside a room full of people before someone finally admits that safety is already slipping away? The tragedy did not announce itself that night. It arrived the following day. On December 14, Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead in their home. The news moved fast, cutting through Hollywood with a shock that left no room for speculation, only disbelief. Within hours, the Christmas party at Conan O'Brien's house was no longer remembered as a gathering filled with warmth and familiarity. It became something else entirely, a moment placed under a microscope. Almost immediately, attention turned toward Rob's son, Nick Reiner, not because of a single piece of evidence revealed to the public, but because memory has a way of reorganizing itself after a tragedy. Conversations that once seemed insignificant were suddenly replayed. Gestures were re-examined. Silences took on weight they had never carried before. People began asking questions they hadn't dared to ask at the time. Had there been signs that night that were easier to ignore than to confront? Were the tensions visible only in hindsight, or had they been present all along? And if they were there, why had no one acted? The memory of the sanctuary cracked under that pressure. What once felt like safety now felt like fragility. The warmth of the room was replaced by the cold clarity of consequence. The laughter, the lights, the familiar faces, all of it was now framed by a single, irreversible fact. Whatever had been unfolding beneath the surface did not end when the party did, and that realization forced an uncomfortable truth into view. The most dangerous moments are not always loud. Sometimes they pass quietly, wrapped in routine, waiting for the future to expose them. When Conan O'Brien finally spoke about that Christmas night, he did not sound like a man accustomed to controlling a room. There was no timing, no rhythm, no instinct to entertain. His voice was slower, softer, as if each sentence had to be weighed before it was allowed to exist. He spoke not as a host, but as someone revisiting a memory he had avoided for as long as he could. Conan said that everything began to fall out of sync from a very precise moment. The door opened. When Rob Reiner entered with his family, the room seemed to sink, almost imperceptibly. No one signaled, no one exchanged glances. Still, several people later said they felt the same thing at once, a subtle but unmistakable shift, as if an invisible source of warmth had been quietly switched off. Rob smiled. It was the familiar smile people had known for decades. Warm, polite, professional. But that night, it appeared briefly and disappeared just as quickly, as if it required effort to hold in place. Those standing nearby noticed something else as well. Rob's eyes were not relaxed. He didn't linger with familiar faces. He didn't arrive with the energy of someone looking forward to an evening of comfort. According to Conan, it felt more like Rob had come carrying a worry with him, something unfinished, something he could not leave outside the door. And that raised a question no one asked out loud at the time. If a place built to feel safe could no longer contain that tension, where exactly had it been coming from all along? While the room slowly returned to its rhythm, another presence began to stand out quietly, without announcement. Nick Reiner did not blend in. As guests formed small circles, laughing and catching up, Nick moved through the space alone. He didn't interrupt conversations. He didn't seek attention. Instead, his eyes traveled across the room, briefly landing on faces before moving on again. It wasn't the kind of looking that invites connection. Several people later struggled to describe it, eventually settling on the same unsettling feeling. They didn't feel stared at, they felt positioned. It was as if Nick wasn't seeing people as individuals, but sorting them, placing them into some internal order that existed only in his mind. No hostility, no sarcasm, just a calm that felt misplaced, especially in a room built on familiarity. At one point, Nick stopped in front of a well-known comedian. There was no handshake, no greeting, just a question delivered evenly, without emotion. "Who are you? Are you famous?" The tone wasn't aggressive. That was what made it heavier. Everyone understood that Nick wasn't asking because he didn't know. He was asking to disrupt, to strip the room of the meaning it had spent decades constructing. In that moment, he wasn't challenging a person. He was rejecting the entire world his father belonged to. And across the room, Rob Reiner saw it all. He didn't intervene. He didn't raise his voice. According to a close friend standing beside him, Rob simply watched as his hand tightened around his glass. Not in anger, in fear. His knuckles turned white as he realized something deeply unsettling. This wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't generational tension. It was the moment Rob understood that the familiar tools he had trusted for years, reputation, love, protection, were no longer holding anything together. And that realization carried a question no one dared to voice. When a son no longer recognizes the world his father built, what exactly is left to protect? The tension did not explode. It surfaced. What drew attention wasn't volume, but tone. Nick's voice stayed low and measured, each sentence delivered slowly, almost carefully. There was no shouting, no sudden outburst, just a cold challenge that made people nearby stop pretending not to listen. Nick turned toward his father. "You're always talking about family values," he said evenly, "but everything has already been arranged for the people you think deserve it." Rob paused. Those who stood close said his response came quickly, as if he had walked this path before, not as a director, not as a public figure, but as a father who had spent years explaining the same thing. "This isn't the time," Rob said. "We've already talked about this." But Nick didn't stop. He began talking about money, about control, about documents that, according to him, had been signed without his consent. He spoke about assets, about decision-making power being placed in the hands of people he believed had nothing to do with him. "You're preparing everything for a world without me," Nick said. "You always have." For those listening, one thing became unmistakably clear. This wasn't a spontaneous argument sparked by alcohol or emotion. These were grievances that had been carried for a long time, now surfacing in the wrong place, at the wrong moment, but fueled by something real. Across the room, people felt the shift. This was no longer a private disagreement quietly contained within a family. It was a collision between two realities, one built on legacy and order, the other on exclusion and resentment. And that collision raised a question no one wanted to answer. When someone believes they've been written out of the future, how far might they go to write themselves back in? Michelle tried to step in. She moved closer, placing a hand gently on Nick's arm. Her voice dropped, lowered not to command, but to plead. "Nick, not here, please." For a brief moment, it seemed like the situation might pause. Then, Nick turned toward her. Those standing nearby later said it wasn't what he said that mattered. It was the look. His eyes sharpened, cold and focused, in a way that instantly changed the balance in the room. Michelle instinctively stepped back. Not in anger, not in fear of violence, but in recognition that she had lost her footing. That small step backward carried more weight than any argument. Because in that moment, something became unmistakably clear. Rob was no longer guiding the conversation. He was no longer steering anything at all. He stood there listening as his son continued to speak, while every familiar tool, authority, reason, love, failed one by one. From the outside, it didn't look dramatic, no shouting, no physical confrontation. But to those watching, the shift was undeniable. This wasn't a family disagreement trying to resolve itself. It was a power structure collapsing in real time. Nick wasn't forcing control through aggression. He didn't need to. The pressure alone was enough. Each word narrowed the space around his parents, leaving them with fewer options, fewer exits, fewer ways to restore balance. And that raised a question that lingered heavily in the room. When authority dissolves without violence, what exactly takes its place? Later, when Conan O'Brien tried to explain what he had witnessed, he avoided describing the exact words exchanged. He focused instead on the feeling. What unfolded in that room, he said, wasn't a family argument in the way people usually understand it. It was pressure. Not the kind that arrives with raised voices or slammed doors, but something quieter, something that closed in slowly. Nick didn't threaten anyone. He didn't need to. His calm, deliberate way of speaking created a sense that no matter what his parents said, the outcome would be the same. That was what froze the room. No restraints were required, no physical force, just the awareness that every possible response led to the wrong result. To speak was to escalate. To stay silent was to concede. The usual rules that guide intervention no longer applied. People later said they weren't afraid of Nick. They were afraid of the moment itself, afraid of stepping into a space where private boundaries had already been torn apart, afraid that any attempt to help would only make things worse. And so, no one moved. The argument didn't end with a final sentence or a clear resolution. It dissolved instead into exhaustion. Nick turned away first. Michelle followed, her face drained of color. Rob remained standing for a few seconds longer, as if he needed to confirm that what had just happened was real. That pause mattered, because it raised a question that lingered long after the room fell quiet. When pressure replaces dialogue, how does a conflict ever truly end? The room didn't recover right away. Rob Reiner stayed where he was, silent, as the tension slowly drained out of the air. Nearby conversations hesitated, unsure whether it was safe to resume. A close friend stepped toward him without saying a word and placed a hand on his shoulder. Rob leaned in slightly. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I don't know what he'll do next." There was no anger in his voice, only fear. Not embarrassment, not frustration. The instinctive fear of a father who had just realized that love and authority were no longer enough to keep control. That quiet confession lingered longer than the argument itself, because it raised a question no one wanted to face. If a father is this afraid, what does that say about what may already be beyond anyone's reach? When the Reiner family left, no one walked them out. There were no goodbyes, no familiar gestures. The door closed quietly, leaving the room suspended in an uneasy stillness. Conversations returned slowly, cautiously, as if no one knew what to say next. What unsettled people most wasn't the argument itself, but what didn't happen afterward. No calls, no message, no one checking in. The night ended, and the tension was left exactly where it had surfaced, unresolved and ignored. And that silence raised a difficult question. When everyone senses something is wrong, but no one acts, where does responsibility truly lie? When Conan O'Brien paused while recounting that Christmas night, it wasn't because he didn't know what to say. It was because he recognized something he had heard before. Rob Reiner had spoken about Nick privately on other occasions, long after guests had gone home and the house had grown quiet. Those conversations were never dramatic. Rob didn't complain. He didn't blame. He spoke carefully, almost cautiously, as if saying too much might somehow make things worse. Conan remembered how Rob's voice changed whenever Nick's name came up. It would lower, slow down, and carry a weight that wasn't anger, but concern. Rob talked about periods of rehab, about moments when hope seemed close, when things felt stable, only for that stability to slip away again. But the details were never the point. What stayed with Conan was the fear beneath them. It wasn't the fear of public embarrassment or damaged reputation. It was something far more instinctive, the quiet fear of a father who senses that his child is drifting beyond his reach, even as he continues to believe that love and patience might still be enough. That wasn't the fear of a celebrity, Conan said later. It was the fear of a father. So when Rob leaned in at the Christmas party and whispered, "I'm scared," it didn't feel like a sudden reaction to that night's argument. It felt like the continuation of something much older, a fear that had existed for a long time, spoken only in private, never fully resolved. What haunted Conan most was not that Rob had seen the warning signs. It was that, despite everything, he still held on to hope. As the investigation moved forward, one reality became increasingly difficult to separate from speculation. Nick Reiner's long struggle with addiction and mental health. People close to the family said Nick had spent years moving in and out of rehabilitation, with repeated attempts to regain stability. Some spoke of as many as 17 treatment efforts. At times, progress seemed real. At others, it vanished without warning. What complicated matters further was the belief that Nick's psychiatric medication had been adjusted shortly before the tragedy. No one claimed this change was the cause. But experts agree on one thing: transitions in psychiatric treatment are among the most fragile periods a patient can experience. Perception can shift. Emotions can intensify. Behavior can become unpredictable. Yet what troubled investigators most came afterward. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Nick behaving calmly. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't disoriented. He selected an energy drink, paid, exchanged brief words with the cashier, and left. The routine appeared ordinary, almost rehearsed. Nick didn't drive. He used public transportation, requiring planning, patience, and awareness of his surroundings. Eventually, he reached a hotel. There, according to reports, he covered the windows with bed sheets, a small action, but one that suggested awareness rather than chaos. Some investigators believe that this period may have been used to clean his clothes. The reasoning is simple. Nick appeared to understand that traces should not remain on his body. That awareness, the idea of removing evidence rather than acting in panic, suggests intention rather than confusion. This detail cannot be confirmed with certainty. No forensic conclusion has definitively established what happened during that time. But when viewed alongside the broader sequence of actions, it presents a reality that is difficult to ignore. This does not resemble the image of someone completely lost in a delirious haze. It resembles someone dealing with the aftermath. And it is precisely this overlap mental instability on one side, organized behavior on the other, that places the case in its most disturbing position. Not fully chaotic, not fully detached from reality, but suspended somewhere in between. At present, Nick Reiner remains in a special supervised unit. According to judicial sources, he is being held at the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, a place reserved for defendants facing serious charges while also being assessed for mental instability. Movement is restricted, contact is controlled. The goal, officials say, is prevention, not punishment. The conditions are harsh. Lights that never fully turn off, constant noise, a routine designed to contain risk rather than restore clarity. Many people deteriorate mentally long before any trial begins. Nick's most recent public appearance did not happen on the street or through a statement. It happened quietly, under the cold white lights of a courtroom. He wore a light blue suicide prevention gown, loose and oversized. His head remained lowered. He did not look around. When addressed, he spoke only 3 words: "Yes, Your Honor." Observers noted that he appeared thinner than before, not just physically diminished, but withdrawn inward, as if trying to make himself smaller within the vast machinery of the legal system. The next court hearing has been postponed. More time is needed, officials say, to assess mental competency and prepare the next steps. For the justice system, it is a procedural delay. For the family left behind, it is an open wound. And for the public, the central question of this case still remains unresolved. Where does illness end and responsibility begin? It is a question no verdict can fully answer, only one that lingers long after the lights dim and the silence returns. After everything, what makes this story so unsettling is not what happened afterward, but what had been present for a long time before. When Conan O'Brien spoke publicly, he did not reveal a hidden scandal. He did not expose a secret conspiracy. What he described was far more brutal in its simplicity. The signs were already there. They appeared quietly, repeatedly, and in plain sight. Fear, spoken in private. Tension that surfaced and was then set aside. Warning signs noticed, but never fully named. Nothing about that Christmas night, taken on its own, demanded a conclusion. No single moment crossed an obvious line. That is what makes it so difficult to face. The story did not hinge on one explosive act, but on a slow accumulation of signals that were easier to live with than to confront. And when the tragedy finally occurred, it did not feel like a sudden rupture. It felt like the end of something that had been unfolding for a very long time. The investigation continues. Legal questions remain unresolved. Mental health assessments are still underway, but beyond verdicts and procedures, a quieter question lingers, one that has no clean answer. At what point does awareness become responsibility? And if all the signs were visible, why did no one believe they were enough? Stories like this rarely end with clarity. There will be court dates, evaluations, and legal arguments. There will be experts debating illness, responsibility, and intent. And one day, there may be a verdict that puts an official label on what happened. But even then, some questions will remain untouched. Because this story is not only about a crime, or a case file, or a final decision handed down by a court. It is about the moments before the warnings that felt uncomfortable, the fears spoken quietly, and the hope that refused to disappear even when it should have been questioned. In the end, what lingers is not certainty, but reflection. How many signs does it take before concern becomes action? How long can hope delay the acknowledgement of danger? And how often do tragedies grow, not from one single moment, but from everything that was seen and left unresolved? These are not questions meant to accuse. They are questions meant to stay. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think, we invite you to share your thoughts below. We will continue to follow this case as new developments emerge.